it's looking at 3 cases in which countries that are heavily involved in peacekeeping operations were consequently suffered from military coups as a result of their peacekeeping operations. So I'm investigating the dynamics of that military interference in politics as a result of the peacekeeping that they did, and seeing what more it might help us to understand about politics of peacekeeping more broadly. So we're very used to thinking about the problems associated with liberal intervention of the last few years, because Western states have been so heavily involved in military interventions, military adventures abroad, in terms of countries, that we're very familiar with the kinds of, we're familiar with that happening, we're familiar with the issues associated with it. What's less familiar is that this is also something which some of the most youthful democracies in the world are also involved in, some of the poorest states in the world, through UN peacekeeping. So the overwhelming majority of UN peacekeepers actually come from developing countries. Over 90% of them come from very poor countries sometimes, or from developing countries, countries that are transitioning from authoritarian forms of government to democratic forms of government. And so all these problems that we think about as associated with spreading the difficulties of spreading human rights, the difficulties of trying to militarily defend democracy, the difficulties of trying to transform societies in a more liberal direction, these are all problems which are by no means confronted by members of NATO, by Western countries, or by the US and UK. They're also confronted by some of the poorest countries in the world, and some of these countries that only have very fragile liberal democracies. So it's thinking about 3 cases in which the costs of these efforts of conducting military operations abroad were so great that it actually ended up subverting democracy at home. And hopefully I'll be able to expand on the significance of these 3 countries and why they're important. So this is the usual path of peacekeeping research. It goes along the lines of, we look at the peacekeepers, we think about their involvement in conflicts, where they go, and it's trying then to explain how we end up to this kind of happy picture of peace at the end. I hope everyone can see the picture. So this is kind of the usual path of the overwhelming majority of peacekeeping research. You have, thank you, UN peacekeepers intervening in conflict, hopefully then bring about peace. This reverses, this paper, and part of the kind of original contribution of the paper is to reverse the path of this conventional route of peacekeeping research, which is instead to think about how sending peacekeepers abroad and the conflict in which the peacekeepers might be involved in might impact on the countries that are involved in sending those peacekeepers. So these are the 3 states and the 3 periods which we're talking about, in which peacekeeping has been implicated in the existing literature and area studies, literature and scholarship of these countries, has resulted in periods of military rule as a result of these countries' involvement in peacekeeping. So these 3 highly, they're atypical cases. Most of the literature associates involvement in peacekeeping operations and military operations abroad with democracy and observance of the rule of law and observance of human rights at home. It's a strong correlation in the literature. So these are outliers. These are exceptions to the general trends which are identified in the literature. Despite the fact that they're highly atypical as cases, my interest in them is, understanding kind of the outlying cases is interesting in and of itself. but also hoping to understand how they differ and what that might tell us about instances that are less extreme. So what I mean by that, I'll hopefully explain or try to explain as we go along. So this is the structure through which I organise these highly different cases. So these are very different countries with very different profiles. And the way in which I try to kind of bring them into a common comparative framework is through this idea of what I've called diversionary peace theory. Diversionary peace theory is the idea that if you're involved in peacekeeping abroad, peacekeeping operations abroad, you're more likely that will provide a boost and help to strengthen the institutions of liberal democracy domestically. And so these three cases are each instances in which you have the breakdown of this theory. And seeing how this theory breaks down, these three cases, is how I structure the investigation, how I see how I make whatever empirical results come through, hopefully meaningful and useful for better understanding the dynamics of work. But that's the basic theory. You send your peacekeepers abroad and it should stimulate liberal democracy at home. Now, there are certain kind of, the way in which that theory is supposed to work is that you have peacekeepers abroad, and then they should hopefully, as a result of their involvement abroad, they'll be exposed to normative ideals of human rights promotion, helping to rebuild societies after conflict, helping to install democracies in conflict countries, all of this. So you have a normative transformation, an identity transformation. So they instead of being kind of ruthless professional killers, they'll turn into pinko, cuddly guardian readers, dangling kids on their knees and helping to play tug of war in nice kind of publicity shots for the UN. So one idea is normative transformation. That's the mechanism through which this theory works. Another idea is that of having them entangled. So if they're too busy doing peacekeeping abroad, they're going to be less likely to interfere in domestic politics at home. That's another mechanism through which the theory is supposed to work. So as you can tell already, the fact that there are so many different routes through which the theory is supposed to work tells you something about its robustness and viability. And seeing how the theory breaks down should hopefully help expose, if nothing else, at least problems with the theory, that these cases help us identify how we might conceptually strengthen our understanding of these dynamics. The theory draws on it's kind of inspired from the experience of Latin America at the end of the Cold War, when you had the so-called back to the barracks moment. But generally speaking, it claims tremendously wider applicability. This theory has also helped to channel hundreds of millions of dollars of aid money for, or kind of military training money from the US to various countries around the world. The idea being if we link it to certain kinds of things, we help countries do peacekeeping, it will help strengthen civil-military relations and help insulate liberal democracy from military interference. So there's a lot at stake in terms of what's claimed about the dynamics of civil-military relations, about the long-term viability of liberal democracy, and at a grand level, hopefully a virtuous circle, right? You help spread liberal democracy and human rights abroad, helps to strengthen liberal democracy and human rights at home, and you get this kind of self-reinforcing virtuous circle. Okay, so what are we talking about? So in terms of these three cases, these are the three men we're talking about. So this is General Muin Ahmed, who was in charge of Bangladesh in 2007, 2008, currently in exile in Florida. This is Commodore Frank Bainimarama, who is military dictator in Fiji, and under his rule, critics of the Fijian regime called Fiji a Bainimarama Republic, which I thought was nice. And then you have this guy here, who's Yahya Jammeh, who notoriously gave a speech at the UN General Assembly where he said he had a potion that could cure AIDS, and said he will rule for 1 billion years if Allah wills it. but also presides over one of the most feared secret police regimes in Africa. Each of these are peacekeepers, or had been peacekeepers, which is interesting in and of itself, but probably stretching a point to claim that their personal experience of peacekeeping had anything to do with it. These are the three men in the three periods. And this is the mechanisms through which peacekeeping led to the breakdown of democracy in Bangladesh in 2007 and 8. One is money, right? So hard currency remuneration meant that the Bangladeshi military was very concerned to preserve its access to hard currency through UN peacekeeping, and was therefore willing to take action against Bangladeshi politicians who possibly threatened it. The other is the size of the military, that it helped to keep if you look at most dictatorships, at the end of a dictatorship, the military size should go down. In Bangladesh, the end of the dictatorship in 1990, the military stays the same size. And part of the reason it does that is because you have so many involved in UN peacekeeping. So UN peacekeeping helped to subsidize the military and to keep it large, disproportionately larger than it would have been otherwise. And then you also have this lady here, Renata Lokhtisarian, who is head of the UN, chief UN representative in Bangladesh. She writes a letter saying that unless the Bangladeshi military interferes in an electoral dispute at the end of 2006, that will jeopardize the Bangladeshi military's access to peacekeeping. The letters are very hard to find. I've looked everywhere for it, so over to you guys, journalists. You can find a copy of the letter from the UNDP, I'd be very grateful. But it's obviously a very important letter, because the UN isn't known for going around instigating military coups, but this is effectively in 2007. So Renata Lokhtisarian, she's still around, so she's in China and Myanmar at the moment as UN representative there. So this is what happened in the case of Bangladesh. In the case of Fiji, you have these forces at work. Again, hard currency remuneration that they receive from the UN for peacekeeping. Fiji is the quintessential peacekeeping state as far as the military goes. You have a very disproportionately large military. Per capita, Fiji has one of the largest militaries in the world. It's comparable to countries like Burma. It never had a military before it started doing peacekeeping. So Fiji, before it did peacekeeping, it was a disaster relief force, what it was effectively had. You look at Fiji on the map, obviously it has no need of a military because it's not like it's surrounded by hostile armed forces on its borders. So money and peacekeeping has given a disproportionately large military force in a country which has no kind of immediate need and demand for a large military. And this also, the experience of ethnic conflict in the peacekeeping operations where Fijians deployed was very important to shaping the Fijian Officer Corps' outlook on peacekeeping as well. In short, story rendered short, their experience of mediating between ethno-political factions of Lebanon gave them the taste and capacity and knowledge as to how to bring it back home. So they're concerned to stop the conflict between Indo-Fijians and Pacific Islanders, native Fijians, escalating into a Lebanon scenario. They took their experience, what they had in UN peacekeeping, and brought it back home in the form of military rule. So Fiji's had a cycle of military rule since 1987, right up to the current period. You only had elections in Fiji in 2014, and they returned Commodore Bainimarama as a politician this time rather than in uniform. In the case of Gambia, I'll speed up now because I'm conscious of time. You had the costs of deployment proved an additional burden to civil-military relations in Gambia, leading to a coup in 1994, and Yahya Jammeh installing himself, and he's remained in power since. And also, more speculatively, in the paper at least, is the possible influence of Nigerian officers. So this was the time in which Nigeria was ruled by military dictatorship, and they were responsible for military training for Gambian officers. So potentially there was some kind of mimetic effect. That's more hypothetical than anything else. Okay, so this is the overall, what emerges as the most squeezing these cases, or what's potentially more generalizable. These are the two things that stand out, that are most interesting and potentially useful. So peacekeeping provides hard currency remuneration, which gives militaries an incentive to preserve that access to external revenue. It also potentially allows for countries to keep a larger military than they otherwise would need or be able to justify. So what this helps us to identify is some problems with the theory as it stands. We have weakly specified unclear causality. It's not clear what the mechanism is that's supposed to produce peace, right, in the countries concerned. You also have entanglement. If you send peacekeepers abroad, they're too busy to launch a coup at home. Clearly doesn't work. At least judging by these three cases, because none of these cases did entanglement abroad prevent military rule from home. More than that, the actual doing peacekeeping might incentivize military rule, right? It gives an incentive to the military to shape foreign policy. It gives an incentive to the military to ensure that certain foreign policies are pursued. It potentially, as we see in the case of Fiji, also gives the military the appetite for and the experience of mediation that they might wish to impose things that they had experienced doing abroad, bring it back home. So all of these things, the experience of these three cases indicates how the theory is lacking, and how the theory, even the terms in which the theory is developed, might lead to the theory just crumbling of its own accord. As regards generalizability, these are based on kind of looking at per capita military sizes. These are some countries to which you might have a similar kind of effect. But even, and then I'll conclude on this, even taking the most kind of optimistic and benevolent assumptions, I think the experience of these three otherwise very atypical countries gives us plenty of reason for skepticism and concern about heavy involvement, heavy use of peacekeeping, and heavy military deployments abroad. The reason being that you could have dangerous effects, even short of military rule, right? If the military becomes heavily invested in a foreign policy which is dependent on external revenue streams, which is dependent on certain kinds of behaviour, on certain kinds of attachments to the United Nations, all of that gives it a orientation perhaps to interfering with the decisions which are reached by elected politicians and elected governments. So it has, even without needing to predict, I'm not trying to predict military coups. I'm trying to identify where potential problems might lie for civil-military relations which are short of coups on the experience of these extreme cases. On the experience of these extreme cases, there's plenty of potential for sabotage to undermining civil-military relations, even short of allied military work. And you also have this, what I've called peace-building Praetorianism, which is the final thought. If you have peacekeepers, the traditional idea is that Praetorianism, military interference in domestic politics, will come from aggressive, expansionist, nationalistic militaries. But the experience of the kinds of things that peacekeepers do abroad now, the extent of what they're involved in operations throughout the world, also might cultivate the very same kinds of appetites for Praetorian rule domestically. Because the kinds of things that they do are exactly the kinds of things that militaries often do when they take over in their own countries. So we have plenty of reason to be doubtful that the theory holds up, and plenty of reasons to be cautious and skeptical about the idea that you can send your military abroad repeatedly on doing all sorts of complicated missions around the world without that carrying political costs domestically. Thank you very much for your attention.
have any questions this week? Thank you, Philip. It's really interesting.
So these countries that become peacekeepers, how and why do they become peacekeepers? What's the process to putting a peacekeeping force in operations?
It's not hard in that you have, at least the United Nations, they just approach their member states and ask them for which ones are available to do peacekeeping operations. And like I said, the overwhelming majority of UN peacekeepers come from countries like South Asian countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, India, but also South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Tanzania. So very often very poor countries, or at the very least developing countries.
Why?
All sorts of reasons. It's very hard to generalise. But it might vary from everything to hard currency remuneration. You get reimbursed by the UN for loaning your troops, to prestige on the international stage, wanting to boost your profile on the international stage, the kind of access it gives you within the United Nations. So the reasons are very broad, and you couldn't easily generalise across all countries as to what motivates them. But it's for this paper at least, it's the feedback effects of that involvement that are most interesting to me. And the side of the story that most often gets overlooked, because everyone's focused on what happens where the peacekeepers go, without thinking about what happens when they come back home.
I apologise because this is a bit of a tangent from what you're talking about, but you've looked a lot into what the effects of UN peacekeeping forces do. I just wonder if you have any thoughts of what happens to the effects on the countries where these forces are stationed. So, for example, in Uganda, in Entebbe, the whole forces for the East Africa are stationed, not necessarily working within Uganda, but it's as a passing point. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
It's an interesting thought, and there is kind of there's lots of research about, say, the politics of bases connected with US bases around the world, and often they're controversial for all sorts of reasons. So I imagine, you might see similar dynamics from once you begin having kind of extensive and sustained military presence, particularly of foreigners in particular locations. You might see similar effects, but it's nothing I could only speculate. I mean, it's not something that I know about, and it's not something that's researched as far as I know.
But that was absolutely fascinating. Journalists are always interested in outlying cases, because we call them stories, so we really appreciate you identifying some for us. But I'm actually interested in why you've chosen outlying cases in this instance. Couldn't the sort of consequences that you're seeking to explore be equally well explored through looking at the role of returning peacekeepers in domestic politics, wherever they have returned from and to?
Yeah, definitely. The question is, how to identify interesting ones. So there are so many countries involved in peacekeeping. You could potentially investigate explore the impact of returning peacekeepers in any country potentially.
There are a couple of countries which until the late 1990s were very actively involved in sending military peacekeeping forces. I'm thinking particularly of Ireland, and for example the role of former Irish peacekeeping soldiers, both in the politics of the Irish Republic and the politics of the North, which is something on which I believe some literature exists.
Well, that's useful because it's not literature I'm very familiar with, because my focus has always been on developing countries' involvement rather than Western countries' involvement in peacekeeping. So there are lots of ways. To skin a cat. These are the most extreme instances of negative effects from returning peacekeepers. So I wanted to look at these most extreme cases to see if we don't kind of assume such extreme, we don't take the extreme, if they still might tell us something about the larger universe of countries. And like I said, I mean, this is what I try to do. I try to squeeze out what else it might tell us. So, but yeah, potentially there's all sorts of levels at which you could investigate it. You could investigate it at the level of, say, revenue. You could investigate it at the level of which units get deployed, something which would be very useful to do. I don't know if journalists in these countries do it, but for example, one of the Bangladeshi units that's most consistently deployed abroad is also the one which is known for human rights violations, systematic human rights violations, and its deployment in counterinsurgency within Bangladesh itself. But the UN doesn't keep data. It keeps kind of gross data on numbers, but doesn't provide, or at least doesn't provide systematic data on the units and what their previous domestic experiences are when they're sent abroad. But that's a pattern that seems to occur. Nigeria, for example, is another one. Part of the reason they're having such difficulty fighting Boko Haram is that all their best units are abroad as peacekeepers. The people who are left are much less well trained, less well armed, less experienced. So there's all sorts of ways to possibly attack it. This is just one way to do it. So, yeah.
So the UN approaches countries within the developing ones and the Western world ones. But say, like in the case of Nigeria, when they know it's a country that currently is facing their own problems, and yet they know that their best units are sent abroad to some level. Don't they ever form where they accepting peacekeepers think, but what effect are we causing on the domestic country and a negative impact? Or do they just consider, well, we need the armed forces, doesn't matter what we take?
Well, they can't, this isn't to suggest that there's a potentially negative impact from UN peacekeeping is obviously something the UN wouldn't wish to acknowledge. And so they wrote a letter to The Economist when The Economist had a line of piece on Fiji. They wrote a letter kind of attempting to rubbish all the claims within the article, drawing these links. So obviously they can't suggest that there's a link because that would seriously undermine the legitimacy of peacekeeping on a global level. But also there isn't any research, very little research, that would draw attention to this. And it's also, they're very, they're desperate for troops. So they can't exactly be picky. If they put round an offer and they say we need so many troops, and somebody comes forward and says we're willing to give you 1,000 for Sudan or Liberia, whatever it is, they're not going to say no, thank you. There is a formal vetting kind of procedure. They try to avoid sending big name mass murderers, or there's kind of supposed to be formal vetting for particular individuals, but it's very nominal. So you have, say, one Rwandan general who is highly implicated in all sorts of terrible things in Congo, who was deployed as a peacekeeper to Darfur. You had a similar pattern with Nepalese peacekeepers involved in counterinsurgency against the Maoists in the 2000s who've been deployed abroad. So the vetting is, it's kind of to legitimise rather than an effective process of trying to make sure that only the right people get sent abroad. But even then, would it work, right? At the end of the day, the places you're sending them, you need people who are tough. Which isn't to say it's legitimate to do that, but peacekeeping is increasingly warfighting. And so there's part of what I'm trying to do with the research is also to dispel naive ideas that we might have of what peacekeepers do and what peacekeepers are. Because at the end of the day, you're relying on soldiers to do certain kinds of things. And at the end of the day, soldiers are professional trained killers. And it's not going to be a surprise if things don't turn out, just because you wrap it up in a blue bow, it doesn't all turn out kind of happy endings. Shouldn't come as a surprise, I hope. You have a question?
No.
No? All right.
What is your opinion or view on how the Rwanda peacekeeping mission occurred during the 1994 genocide? I know it's a bit controversial because there were a lot of mistakes. I'm sure so many others can learn from. But
Yeah, it's one of the classic. It's the kind of one of the big totemic failures of UN peacekeeping. There are two things, I suppose, I'd say in response. One is that the overwhelming literature, the overwhelming consensus of the literature is that peacekeeping works. So most people are familiar with the failed peacekeeping operations from the 90s, Rwanda being the most famous or victorious one, Bosnia and Somalia being the others. But the overwhelming, from the best kind of findings of the literature is that if you have peacekeepers, you are less likely to have a recurrent violent conflict, and you may even have a positive kind of reduction in the rates of civilian casualties, depending on the kinds of mandate that you give the peacekeepers. So, in big picture terms, peacekeeping seems to be effective, depending on what you count as effective, right? I don't think that's the total story, but that's at least what the literature says. As regards Rwanda, I don't think, my feeling is that the story, a lot of it is kind of what should have happened comes from Romeo Dallaire, the Canadian peacekeeper who was on the ground. And he said if he'd had just 5,000 troops, he'd been able to stop the majority of the killings. And I don't think that's credible at all. So he said it because I think it's a story that's been kind of retroactively fitted to kind of justify and suit the needs of peacekeeping today. If you look at what was happening in Rwanda, for a start, we have 100,000 deaths in a very short period of time. The violence is very decentralized, it's very spread out all over the country. And where the violence was most intense in the southwest of the country at the time of the killings was very far from Kigali, which is where Dallaire said that he would have deployed the majority of peacekeepers. So maybe you could have stopped the killings, but I think it would have taken many more than 5,000 troops, and it would have taken, and it probably wouldn't have been a peacekeeping operation. So the conventional story which is told about peacekeeping in Rwanda, I think is flawed. But obviously, that's controversial, and lots of people would disagree with me about that. But I don't buy the argument that it would have taken, a few thousand peacekeepers would have been able to solve a conflict on that scale. I just don't find credible.
Talking about sources, as a journalist, if you want to follow these kinds of stories, is the UN the only source, or are there observatories, or who are the people who kind of keep an eye on this and track it?
Very few. So there's mainly because a lot of it is it's developing countries. So generally people don't care about the UN, right? So there's less interest in them generally, less than the Western press, or only kind of appetite for certain kinds of stories. There, like I say, there's an Economist piece on Fiji. The other cases are much less explored, journalistic. There isn't a lot of academic research on it either, which would feed into journalistic investigation. And you have to look in different places to put the story together. Because you have to be familiar with how the UN works, for example, to understand what happened with the story in Bangladesh. All of it hinges around, as far as I can tell, what I've investigated, all of it hinges around the timing of one phone call. And it's the timing of the phone call which determines whether or not New York gave the order for the Bangladeshi military to take over. And I don't think they did. But the Bangladeshi, so, it's kind of, you need to know how the UN works, and you also need to kind of have a sense of what was happening at the time and internal actors. So the bar to reconstructing what happened is quite high, and requires knowledge of all sorts of different kind of moving parts in different parts of the world. But this data is all there. The data in terms of gross numbers, in terms of per capita military size, you can estimate how much money countries are making off peacekeeping fairly easily. It's a crude measure, but you can get a sense of how much they're earning. More stories, more journalism on this would be fantastic.
Is it clear in every case that you've looked at that the revenue that the nation is gleaning from the United Nations in return for the dispatch of its peacekeepers is substantially greater than the cost of maintaining that peacekeeping force? Is it clear that at every stage the nation is making a profit from it?
based on the data that's available for these countries, particularly Bangladesh and Fiji, yes. So it's obviously something that's hard to establish because countries, often military spending is disguised or camouflaged or confidential or all sorts of
Well,
things.
it must be, mustn't it? Because they are supposed to be claiming from the UN the real cost of maintaining the peacekeeping force.
Yeah, but they're reimbursed in hard currency, and it's a flat rate across everyone. So everyone gets roughly $1,000 for every peacekeeper they send. And obviously $1,000 goes much further in Bangladesh than it does here. So, like I say, the best available data suggests that certain countries are able to subsidize their military budgets to a significant degree. But in terms of a precise kind of how much they get in versus how much they pay out, it's very hard to establish without kind of more precise data. Though some of it is available. I mean, on Bangladesh, some of it's available. But it would, again, that would be just sheer lack of data is part of the problem. And it is the kind of data which you would need to piece up from journalistic investigation. Whether or not journalists in these countries have looked into this, I'm not sure. I mean, from what I can tell, not really. I mean, I'm sure they have a lot more, these are countries which have obviously had not exactly been paradises of press freedom. So there's that. And they also have lots of other problems which, journalists would look at as well. And might be more pressing as well.
Yeah, I suspect, I haven't looked at it, but I suspect you'd find that the Institute for War and Peace reporting might be a more profitable source than domestic reporting in these cases.
Just at the beginning of your talk, you talked quite a lot about the way in which peacekeeping is very much tied up with notions of sort of Western democracy and, I guess kind of Western values more broadly. And I wondered if you could say anything, or whether you've kind of come across anything in terms of this sort of process, the knock-on effect that these cases have had for the countries you talk about, in terms of sort of Western cultural values kind of seeping back to these countries, and what the consequences of that would be to you?
It's not something that I'm not. It's one of those things which just isn't explored. I mean, it would be really interesting. So the idea that the Fijians took their experience of Lebanon is based on what a Fijian officer in exile has himself said. And if you look at the operational orders given for the coup in '86, it says the operational orders from the military say we don't want to have Lebanon and Fiji, therefore we're taking over. So that's easy to establish. How far they it might work the other way. You could say there might be positive effects from them doing this stuff abroad and bringing it back home. I don't know. It's but it would be it'd be interesting to see how far, if you went in Eastern Congo and interviewed peacekeepers there and said how far they feel like they're on the front line of defending human rights and these things, and how far they kind of subjectively feel that that's what they're doing. I don't know. But it would be very interesting. And again, it's not the kind of thing which, unfortunately, it's not the kind of thing which draws interest or money, and still kind of is overlooked. If you ask most people, they think that who does peacekeeping? Well, we do it because of Afghanistan, or the French do it, or Americans do it, which it just isn't true. It's about 100,000 troops around the world, but 90% of them, if not more, come from developing countries, as far as UN peacekeeping goes.
So, any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much.